it helps to make the link between what can I do and change, because change is nothing but what we do. There is nothing else. And that's hard to remember sometimes. We think that somehow someone out there is moving stuff behind the curtains. No, it's just us.
A question asked courageously, answered honestly, and lived authentically can change your whole life. For me, that question was, how can I use what I have, what I love, and what I know to bless the lives of others? The School for Good Living and this podcast are one answer to that question. Hi, I'm Brian Miller. I know that the world can work for everyone, but that it won't until it works for you. I've created this to help you make the difference you were born to make. It's a series of conversations with thought leaders who are moving humanity forward. And in each episode, I explore their lives and the work they do. I also ask them to break down how they've gotten their books written, published, and read. This podcast is all about exploring the magic and mystery, and sometimes the misery, of the creative process. So if you have a mission, a message, and the motivation to share it, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the School for Good Living. Today, my guest is Rebecca Henderson. Rebecca is the author of Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. Rebecca is a professor at Harvard Business School and teaches the most successful elective course in the last few years, a course called Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems. She is a sustainability advisor to several of the world's largest companies. Rebecca says that for the last 15 years, 3 truths have kept her up at night. First, the world is on fire. Second, wealth is rushing to the top. And third, the institutions that have historically held the market in balance, families, local communities, faith traditions, government, are crumbling or even vilified. But as she studied these issues and she's taught about them over the last decade and a half, and as she's wrestled with the question of what businesses can do about these problems and what our individual role might be, she says that what's emerged is hope. And that's one thing that I appreciate about this book, is that it does not only explain the issues in ways that we can better understand them, but that we can understand what we might do about it. I was interested to talk to Rebecca because I know that capitalism has lifted so many out of poverty and increased the standard of living and the quality of life for so many people, but it hasn't come without its own issues. Somebody who is looking deeply at these questions, what have been the consequences of our actions as a society, and where are we headed, and what can we do about them? So 2 things that stood out to me as a result of reading this book and having this conversation with Rebecca. Number 1, I'm really glad to know that she is at Harvard teaching the world's future business leaders these insights. The other thing that stood out is I really appreciate her view about business finding a balance between both profit and purpose, about the reality that's embedded in that, and about how each of us can do something to make a difference, because the things that we're doing already matter, but how can we be more conscious, or how can we make an even greater contribution? So with that, if you want to learn more about Rebecca and her work, you can visit reimaginingcapitalism.org. You can find her on Twitter at Rebecca Recap. I hope you enjoy this conversation with my new friend, Rebecca Henderson. Rebecca, welcome to the School for Good Living.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm delighted and honored to be here.
Yes, I'm so glad you are. Will you tell me, please, what's life about?
I think life is a song the universe is singing. I think my life is a song the universe is singing. It is fragile, effervescent, will certainly come to an end, but that's no reason not to sing as best one can.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I like to think I have an open mind and I'm not attached to a specific version of the future, but that was not the expectation I had for your response to that. So given that, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to jump right to it. You wrote this book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, a very important and timely book for the situation we find ourselves in. As we're recording this, it's July of 2020. We're still in the thick of the pandemic. Here in the US, it seems to be intensifying despite what I hope are not our best efforts. But in your book, you say the roots of our current predicament are fear and separateness. Not just speaking about the pandemic, of course, but about the situation we find ourselves in. And I realize there's not a lot of context for the listener yet, so maybe I should back up and have that be at least my second question, which is this. Will you tell me this book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, Why did you write this book? Who did you write it for? And how did you want the world to be different because of it?
I wrote the book because my students insisted that I do so. I was teaching a course called Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems. And the course was about, if you're a business person, given the mess the world's in, what really can you do? And given that it's easy to think that, yeah, I can change my own light bulbs and hire a few people and behave well at work, could the things that business people do actually add up to the kind of widespread systemic change that I think we need if we're going to build the kind of world we deserve and can build? So I was teaching this course, 28 1.5-hour sessions, started out with 28 people. I was teaching 200 in 2 big groups. And students would come to me and say, Rebecca, you need to write this down. I need to be able to give it to my friends. I want to be able to share this with the firm where I work. And that seemed like a really good reason to write a book, because I think we're in a horrible mess, really a horrible mess. And I think business can play an important role in helping to get us out of it. And there are thousands of amazing people working in this space. But I thought maybe the perspective I developed, which was of a sort of pragmatic framework, like how could these things add up to really large-scale change, and some of the examples I developed might be useful. And I figured if my students hadn't found anything else, then I might as well write the book. So I wrote the book for all of us who are trying to make a difference, because it can be really hard work and the temptation to despair is great. And I tried to write the book about, here's how everything that we're doing could add up. What are my goals for the book? I hope a few people read it and find it useful and that it makes a difference. And in my best and most wildest moments, I hope I'm part of the wave that leads us to think about business as an integral part of our society. This whole idea that the goal of business is to maximize shareholder value, it never was that. It was always about prosperity and freedom, but right now it definitely shouldn't be about that. It's about building a healthy and thriving society. And so I hope I play some small role in changing that narrative so that we come to take that for granted. Of course, business is part of the solution. Why shouldn't it be? So that's my kind of grand hope for the book.
I love that. I realize, I mentioned this before we started recording, that our family has started talking about this book inside our 40-year-old family enterprise. And I do believe that the thoughts and the examples that you're sharing are an important part of change, or they show what's possible. They encourage us to think about new things. And this idea, like you're saying, about maximizing shareholder value as the primary directive of business carried out to its ultimate end, unmitigated, is extremely destructive to environments and to people, right? And clearly government isn't sufficient to just check that. But ultimately, we each can play a role in that. But let me then go back to that question that I was asking before you just answered that question about, you say the roots of our current predicament are fear and separateness, which I believe that. But why do you say that? And what can we do about it?
We have got stuck in a historical moment where we have persuaded ourselves that it's all about me and all about now. And I'm generalizing horribly, of course. But if we think about American consumer society and even global society more generally, horrible generalization, but particularly here in the States, we sort of persuaded ourselves that the goal of life was self-realization and happiness and sometimes getting as much stuff as you could. And we persuaded ourselves that the current moment was like the only moment. Grab it while you can. But feels to me as if every faith tradition that humans have ever seen, not to mention every parent of a 2-year-old, has understood that focusing only on yourself and only on the current moment is not a route to happiness. To use the Buddhist phrase, that it's unskillful. And so why is it really that we focus only on me right now? What is driving that? What makes it so hard to think about us and the longer term? What makes it hard to think about the longer term is fear, right? I want it now, because who knows what the future will build. I've got to get my stuff, get my connections, make sure I'm okay right now. And so to me, a lot of what drives us is fear. And then why do we have such trouble thinking about us? Because we have this wild illusion that we can exist separately from everyone else. I mean, right now, as we sit here in the middle of the pandemic, that illusion seems even more crazy, right? The idea that I'm not healthy if you're not healthy, my society is not healthy if you feel so angry and so separate. I think the fact that we are an integral part is sort of really front and center, which I hope is hopeful. But yes, fear and separateness, there are many demons that haunt the human race, but these are the two that in my own work I keep bumping up against all the time.
And I love too that you devote the last chapter 8, to this idea of finding our own path to changing the world and encouraging readers to take personal action to make a difference. Because I'm reminded often of a quote that I heard attributed to Alice Walker about the most common way that we give up our power is by believing we don't have any. And of course, if we don't think that the things we do matter, if we don't think that we're powerful, we'll continue to do whatever we're doing, unskillfully, and perhaps contribute to a circumstance that's really not working. And you say that what can I do is the question that you're asked most often, right? And certainly the most important one. But when somebody asks you that, how do you typically answer it?
I begin by trying to acknowledge the fact that so many of us feel powerless. Let's be clear, it's for a good reason. There are 7 billion people on the planet? That's a lot of people. And from some perspectives, none of us can do anything. If we think of doing something as being the person that leads the change that makes the difference, none of us can be that. There's 9 billion of us, and it wouldn't be good if you or I were the one that, drove the change on our white horse. And even the people that we think are like that, like Mandela or Martin Luther King, they were amazing human beings, but there were lots of people that worked with them to drive the change that they did. So I always open by saying something like, let's be clear, none of us can do anything. We really dust on the wind. But if we do nothing, nothing will happen. And that what really drives change is a slow accretion of movement. In the book, I use the analogy of an avalanche, right? When an avalanche happens, it's like amazing. But which pebble triggered the avalanche? Nobody knows. There's no way of knowing. And so this is a metaphor that works for me, at least, is I think we're all pebbles and we're trying to contribute to that avalanche. And we need the avalanche and we need the pebbles. And then the third thing I say is, and you will feel much better if you try. I really noticed in myself that the year or two I spent thinking, oh my goodness, there's nothing that can be done. Climate change is coming for us all. There's nothing that can help. That was not a good year. And I'm not saying that now I'm happy and upbeat all the time. I wake at 4 a.m. I suspect many of us do, thinking about what's happening in the world right now, going, oh my God, here I am in my little corner of the world teaching MBAs, and what good is that? But having started down this path, my experience has been you meet the most amazing people. And to know that you're spending your day trying, however tiny what you're doing, is so much better than not. And feeling that you're part, now I'm going to go grandiose, but feeling that you're part of where the future is headed, where the universe is going, to get back to my opening metaphor, that you're singing the song you were meant to sing, that's fantastic. And then, depending on the person, I get down to brass tacks. I'm like, okay, what do you do? What are your skills? How can you help? Because all of us can make a difference. Part of the good news about this being such a huge problem is there's lots of places to push. And so, helping someone find their own path, which, by the way, my experience has been everybody knows. All I do is ask the questions like, well, what do you feel called to? What do you feel drawn to? What are your own skills? And so, holding the space and then doing a lot of listening. That's how I answer the question.
That's very thoughtful and very beautiful. And I love what you said in the book, and you just touched on the same idea here. You say, there is no better antidote to despair than working together with others to drive change. I think that's really true.
And I mean it.
Yeah.
Yes, I really mean it. That's certainly been my experience. And I know others have found that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that surprised me in this chapter, you talk about the importance of taking care of oneself, about practicing. I don't know that you use the word self-care, but You say, take care of yourself and remember to find joy. Why is that important?
I can't remember who said this, and I'm embarrassed not to be able to remember, but someone whose name we would both know said, in this time, self-care is a radical act of political resistance. Because if we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't find joy, we lose the oomph, to use a technical term. We lose the clarity and the passion. And the 2 months since my book's been published, I've really been dancing this line. So I feel like I can really speak from experience at the moment. The book's got some attention, which is fantastic, and I have a day job. So I've been trying to do both. And there have been a couple of times when I've taken myself right to the edge of exhaustion. Because I've been trying, I can do that one more talk. I can write that one more piece. I've got to do everything I can, but it doesn't help. Collapsing in exhaustion, going to work feeling, why am I doing this? Just feeling drained, feeling everyone else is taking advantage of you. That's no way to do anything. And so when my husband, who's very good at this, says, okay, you are not working tomorrow, we are taking the day off, the next day I come back with so much more energy and space, and everything seems easy, as opposed to everything being a chore and hard. Everything seems easy. Now, it's easy for me to say this. I really want to say this brilliant, because I'm guessing there are a number of people on the call right now that don't have the luxury of being able to take a day off and take care of themselves. I'm a mom. I know what it's like to have a child at home and to be trying to work at the same time. My son is now 6'6" and towers over me, so I don't have to do that right now, but I'm thinking of people who have lost their jobs or are trying to do their job with the kids right there, or worried about money. And maybe saying, take care of yourself sounds like an incredible luxury. But this is part of what I say to corporate executives. I say, sometimes you have to take the time, because if you don't, you can't give to what's around you. And so sometimes doing that really hard thing, and I've done it, which is, giving your child to someone to take care of for a moment, or your partner to take care of, or really just forcing yourself to exercise or meditate. It can feel so hard, but it really pays dividends.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that in my life and with people that I coach. You've probably heard it described this way as well, about inhaling and exhaling. That if we were to relax all the time and just play and mess around, that wouldn't be a fulfilling life, but neither is just going or giving to the point of being depleted. And I remember I was surprised to learn of this term that's often used in the healthcare industry, overcare, with nurses and doctors, medical, who are so focused on taking care of others that they don't care for themselves, and then they do burn out and get depleted. And so that totally makes sense to me. And I'm really glad that you included this in your book. And part of what I love too is about how you do talk about these big, seemingly intractable problems that affect the whole globe, but then being able to bring it all the way down to a personal level that does acknowledge the reality of an individual's lived experience. And I think that's really beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you. I tried so hard to do that, because it's so easy to talk at the high level, like nyada, 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 here's what capitalism should look like. And then you can tell stories, but then how do the stories add up? And so I really tried, no, this is what change looks like. This brand manager on the ground doing this, that's what it looks like. Yeah, well, thank you.
I learned a lot. I'd read a little bit about palm oil, but I didn't know about palm oil until I read this and the story that you tell about Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, and the transformation he made. And I maybe shouldn't open that door, because I didn't actually intend to go too far down it, except to say some of the stories that you tell to give a personal reality to this, I thought were really moving.
It helps to make the link between what can I do and change, because change is nothing but what we do. There is nothing else. And that's hard to remember sometimes. We think that somehow someone out there is moving stuff behind the curtains. No, it's just us. Oh, but thank you. I thank you for your kind words. I really appreciate it.
And I am glad to hear that there has been interest in this book, and I hope it continues, because as I said earlier, I think this is a very timely and important message, especially for those who are in positions of leadership in business, right? Well, let me ask this. Before I transition us to the Enlightening Lightning Round, I just have two more questions in this section. The first one is, it's kind of a two-part question, so feel free to answer either or both. But as you wrote this book, as you published it, what surprised you about it, and or how is your life different now as a result?
One of my closest friends had lunch with me the first month I was going to start on the book, about 3 years ago now. And we went out for lunch, and she's fabulous. Her name is Stephanie Connor, and she's a no-nonsense kind of person. And she looked at me, she said, "Rebecca, so how are you going to write this book?" And I started mumbling. And she said, "Are you telling stories?" And I said, "Well, stories? I mean, I'm a business academic. I don't really tell stories." And she said, "Remember, anyone can put the book down at any time and go and watch Netflix reruns. You have to write this book so it's as compelling as it can be." I was floored. I mean, I've been turning out turgid academic prose my entire life. And the idea that now I had to write a book that was kind of fun to read and had stories and, oh my goodness. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought she was right. So I tried really hard to write a book that was fun to read. And the thing that has surprised me most is that's what I hear most. I get almost indignant emails saying, "Dear Rebecca, I read your book in a weekend. It was so easy to read." And they have that kind of overtone. It's like, "But you're supposed to be a serious scholar and there's supposed to be a serious book. What are you doing making it easy to read?" And that's what really I'm so delighted by. People tell me, it gives them a roadmap and helps them think about what to do. And that's everything I hoped for and I guess expected. But it was really fun to read. I hadn't expected that at all.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Bonus. So the other question that I have here is, what haven't we talked about as it relates to reimagining capitalism that feels important to you or might benefit our listener?
We haven't talked about the fact that if we're to reimagine capitalism, we need to reimagine our democracy.
Yeah, that's certainly a big thing, right? And I've heard this recently. I don't recall who said it, but they said something like, we're facing 21st century problems with an 18th century governmental structure, with technology that's largely in the 20th century, or maybe it's 19th century. I'm butchering that quotation, but when I heard it described that way.
It's the quote, and it's from E.O. Wilson, and we have godlike technology, medieval institutions, and Paleolithic emotions.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. Yeah, I can see why I wouldn't have put together that we're not going to reimagine capitalism without reimagining democracy. That sounds like a sequel to me.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Well, with your permission, I want to go ahead and transition us to the Enlightening lightning round.
Sounds good.
Oh, and by the way, my aim here is to ask the question, and for the most part, to stand aside. You're welcome to answer as long as you want, but my aim is to just keep us moving. So That's the design. Okay, question number 1. Please complete the following sentence with something other than a box of chocolates. Life is like a
song.
All right, you're congruent. I'm just checking. No, that's great. Okay, life is like a song. Okay, question number 2. I'm borrowing Peter Thiel's famous question. What important truth do very few people agree with you on?
That we will only reimagine capitalism if we bring our personal purposes to work. But that does not mean we need to change the way firms are run. Most people want to go either it's all about shareholder value maximization, don't talk to me about purpose, or it's all about purpose, don't talk to me about shareholder value. And I think it's really important to hold both those conversations at once.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Okay, question number 3. I know this might be a stretch, but please just go with me. If you were required every day for the rest of your life to wear a t-shirt with a slogan on it, or a phrase or a saying or a quote or a quip, what would the shirt say?
You know that. It would say, "You are a song the universe is singing."
I love it. That's beautiful. Okay, number 4. What book, other than one of your own, have you gifted or recommended most often?
A book called Classical Chinese Poetry by Charles Hinton. It is the most marvelous book. It goes through Chinese poetry period by period, explaining why the poets are focusing on what they're focusing on. And then it includes the most amazing poems. I mean, there's poems written in the 300 AC, And it's incredible. I mean, the idea that nearly 2,000 years ago, people were having exactly the same issues and problems and troubles that we have now, and it's transmuted into the most beautiful art. That's the book I give away or recommend most often.
Okay, question number 5. What's one thing you've started or stopped doing in order to live or age well?
When I was 40, I started playing the cello. My son had just gone to school for the first time, and I knew that if I didn't do something, I would fill up all the time that had been filled with my really hands-on child raising. Those first 5 years are really intense. I would just fill that time with work. And so I took up the cello because I'd always wanted to play. I thought it would be an incredible relaxation. And I thought maybe in 10 or 20 years, I can play Beethoven string quartets.
That's amazing. I have the feeling that if you were into philosophy, you would learn German to read the original, whatever it was. So that's great. Okay, thank you for that. Let me just ask this on the topic of that. So what have been the benefits to you of learning to play the cello?
Oh, it's something you do with your hands and your body as well as your mind. So you really can't play the cello and think about anything else. And playing music with other people, there's really nothing like it. I mean, there's one other thing like it, and it's nearly as good as that one other thing. Because you just have to listen, and you're creating this incredible thing together, and you're inside the music. And to have had that experience, to be able to routinely have that experience, that's amazing. That's an incredible gift.
Yeah, it really is. And on this, I'm reminded, hearing you talk about it now, just about how magical music live really is, and how I was thinking about this, probably less than for me at least, 1/100th of 1% of the music I hear is live. It's like become white noise or something. But when you're producing it and feeling the instrument and things, I mean, I'm not a musician, but I've tried. So I'm reconnecting a little bit with the magic that you're describing now. Thank you.
And let's be clear, I'm a terrible cellist. I mean, I play as well as a not very good 14-year-old because I took it up so late. And it's still amazing to do. I mean, your whole body vibrates with the music. It's fantastic.
That's beautiful. Okay, question number 6. What's one thing you wish every American knew?
That climate change is real and is coming for us, and there will be no vaccine. And it will make everything worse.
Yeah, me too. I wish every American knew that as well. Okay, question number 7. What's the most important or useful thing you've ever learned about making relationships work?
That all the other stuff we do, cook dinner, play the cello, go to work, write books, read books, exercise, all that other stuff, it's so much less important than the relationships. In my first marriage, I thought that who had picked up the dry cleaning or what we were going to eat for dinner or the fact that we'd spent a little more money than we'd expected to spend, I thought that was the important stuff. Absolutely not. And it was the relationship that was important. It was sharing my life with this incredible, amazing human being. The gift of a live human being in your life, giving you their attention. That's what's important. And it's really reshaped. I promised myself if love ever walked back into my life, I would be really, really nice to it. And I'm very fortunate. Love did walk back into my life. And, how I manage my relationship is quite different as a result.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate this. This is a part of my standard question set, but you do talk in the book about losing your husband unexpectedly and even being the one to find him, right? And now about the promise you made to yourself about if love walked back into your life. How do you live each day in relationship now as a result of that? Like what's different or what's present now?
Oh, I just make time. I mean, I'm not perfect, right? I'm human, so I'm grumpy and I'm slow and I work too much. But I try and always pay attention. So we have some rituals that the two of us share in the morning, and then work like crazy all day, but then we always go for a walk together if we can and have dinner if we can. And I just tell my husband how incredibly fortunate I feel to have found him. And I mean it. And, there are times that he does things that annoy the heck out of me. And always I remember there are times I'm doing things that annoy the heck out of him, and they're not important.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about just about all the big things in life: love, death, music, just about all that's left. is money. So the final question here, the enlightening lightning round, is about money, which is, aside from compound interest, what's the most important or useful thing you ever learned about money? Or what's something you're always sure to do with it or you never do with it?
I spent too much of my life thinking money was too important. Of course, it's important to have enough to live and to be able to pull one's own weight and take care of oneself and the people that one loves. But it really is the case that beyond that, it's a snare and a delusion. And that's easy for me to say because I have a steady job and I'm a tenured professor at Harvard. But when I go to my reunions, the HBS reunions, I meet people who've made really enormous quantities of money. And many of them are not very happy.
Yeah, I know a few people like that too.
Okay. And having no money at all is, of course, no fun at all. So, I mean, like all things, one should pay attention in moderation. But my father went bankrupt when I was young. And so that really focused my attention on money in a way that in retrospect was not that helpful.
Yeah, that's a big insight. So I do have just a few more questions about writing and creativity before we conclude, but so I don't forget this or squeeze it at the very end. If people want to learn more from you or they want to connect with you, of course they can go to Amazon or their local bookstore, which hopefully will have a copy of this book and is open and safe to attend. So they could buy Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. But beyond that, if people want to learn more from you or connect with you, what would you have them do?
So they could go to the webpage for the book, reimaginingcapitalism.org. I've put a lot of my writings and my podcasts and my media appearances and so on. So if you would like to learn more, you can see me in action and read a bunch about my work. At the moment, I don't really have bandwidth to have personal conversations, except with my students, because I still have a day job. And I have to give them priority and my colleagues priority at the moment, just because it's a really busy time. I'm hoping that will change. But at the moment, it's hard to get through to me personally.
Understood. Okay. Thank you for that. And also, as a way of saying thank you, Rebecca, for making time to talk with me and share your experience and your wisdom with me and everyone listening, I have gone on kiva.org and I've made a $100 microloan to an entrepreneur on your behalf. This is a woman in Indonesia named Melianya who will use this money to buy more electronic goods and various daily necessities to grow her business. She's 30 years old with a son and a daughter, and she's been running this little business for a couple of years. So it's a way she provides for her family and improves the quality of life in her community. So thank you for giving me a reason to make that microloan.
Oh, thank you very much. What a wonderful thing to do. I'm honored and touched.
And my pleasure. Okay, so the final part of our conversation here, I just want to ask you a few questions about writing and creativity. I want to start by asking you about your writing routine. When I originally invited you to be on this show, you mentioned that Friday, which is the day I typically record, is a day you typically write. And I loved that you had the clarity and the discipline of this is what I do when. And clearly, I think it was Zuckerberg, who said real artists ship. And you ship, so you get your words done and out into the world, which is more than many people who aspire to do what you've done. But will you tell me what your writing routine or maybe routines look like and how they might have evolved over the years as you've written?
When I was working on the book, I often joked to my friends that now I understand why I had never written a book before, because it requires one to actually sit down at a desk and write. And, I'd always intended to write, and writing academic journal articles is relatively straightforward because you can get them done in a week or two. And so you have the immediate hit of, I finished the article, or at least a draft of the article. And an academic article has a very fixed form, like a sonnet. So, you have to have the introduction, and then there's the problem, and then there's the data, and then you write up the results. Plus you have a co-author. Co-authors are great, may I say, because they say, we need that draft by next Tuesday. Writing the book was hard because it's much longer. It's a much longer project and you're trying to hold it in your head at the same time. And because there's not much immediate feedback. And so I was incredibly privileged and fortunate by the fact that my husband is an author. He's a professor at Brown and he's written 6 or 7 books. And he has a study 20 feet away from me into which he would go every morning and just start writing. And in the beginning, I couldn't do more than a couple of hours. I just couldn't. We were on sabbatical. That was very fortunate to be given the time off to write the first draft. And I just couldn't do more than a couple of hours. I get distracted, I get itchy, I'd find other things to do. And it was just the practice of just staying with it and working with it. And one of the things I learned, which you must have heard from many people, but was news to me, is that writing in itself can be a craft and can be fun. And when my husband first said this, I was like, you have to be kidding. I'm just writing this book because I have to write this book. My students are insisting I got to write the book. Okay, I'm just going to write the book. And he would be like, no, think about what you're trying to do and who you're communicating to and how the sentences flow. I was like, how the sentences flow? Like, really? But he takes such delight in writing that a little bit of that rubbed off on me. And then the rest is just brute force determination. I was just like, I am going to finish this book. I did find it was helpful to stop when things were going well. So when the flow was good, I find it very helpful to block out hours and have, okay, I'm going to do 5 hours of work today and 4 of them are going to be writing and then I'll do email for whatever. And for me, it really works to block off Fridays and the first couple of hours of every day because that's my best time. I think everyone is different. So that's just what worked for me.
Yeah, no doubt about that. It's, I think, part of the challenge of producing finished work is really discipline is in there for sure. But even before we have the chance to apply discipline, I think is learning our own preferences and styles, right?
For sure.
So I'm really interested in the particulars, especially because I think people who are aspiring to write or who are writing but are maybe stuck, which I know is a common occurrence in a project. You know, I'll meet people who've been stuck in a book project for years, in some cases, that sometimes the little things that work for other people do in fact work for them, which is why I'll ask these next couple questions. One is, do you write with music or no music?
I'm a no music person. I cannot handle distraction.
Okay. What about caffeine? What role does caffeine play in your creative process?
I'm immensely sensitive to caffeine and I love it as a result. And I'm passionate about, delicate green teas, and I allow myself 1 mug a day, to which I really look forward and which I really enjoy. And I have it at the moment of the day my energy goes lowest, which for me is about the 4 or 5 o'clock time when I'm just really slowing down and I don't want to do any more and I just want to lie down. And it can be really helpful. It really kind of helps me focus. But that's a really personal thing. I mean, I've known people who mainlined caffeine the whole time. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I know someone who is very creative. He wasn't a writer per se, but he was a coder and a designer, and he died at 50. It really surprised, me and pretty much everyone who's friends with him. But when I look at his caffeine consumption, I think, man, that might have had something to do with it, like for real,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a delicate thing. Let me ask you again, going back specifically to Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. Well, let me ask this because I'm curious. I know there's a story behind every book and everyone, develops in its own way, its own time. But what was your working title for the book?
Open Systems Strategy.
You know what? My internet cut out there for just a moment. Will you say it again?
It's such a terrible title that it's possible your brain just cut out for a moment. Open Systems Strategy.
And why did you choose that as the working title?
Oh, because the whole sort of theory of change is all about driving systemic change and being open to what might come. But it's a terrible title. Nobody knows what it means. I mean, it was a working title, to be fair, for about a week. It's just like, what is that book about? And so I thought, well, I'll just call it after the course. And so I was going to call it Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems. But then I thought, well, that's a bit vague too. So I called it In a World on Fire to try and communicate that this wasn't a dry academic treatise, that I was really serious. Like, how do we reimagine capitalism?
That makes sense. And I think, my experience is there really is something powerful that can happen once one of our projects gets a name that just feels right. And it's like, boom, it just kind of coalesces and this thought or a structure comes together in a certain way. I understand you had this years of teaching the content, and you had the benefit of hearing how it was landing with people and getting their feedback. And I understand that you had, I don't know if collaborator is the right term, maybe a co-professor or something.
So I had the great good fortune of teaching the class for 6 or 7 years before I sat down to write the book. And I had taught the class with a couple of colleagues who I really liked and respected. And I thank them in the book. And it's really true that so many of the ideas in the book came out of that ongoing conversation and from talking to my students and from talking to groups about these ideas. It's interesting. I thought that that experience would make writing the book easy. I thought I'd be able to do it in like 8 months, no problem. I've been teaching it. I've been talking about this. All I need to do is sit down and write it down. But I discovered that it's one thing to talk about an idea, and it's quite another to write it down. And that in fact, when you talk, there are often things you take for granted, or you're responding to what the people you're talking to have in mind. And so in fact, the translation to the page was much harder than I expected. So it was hugely helpful to have all that experience, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. It's like, and again, I think it's been attributed to Einstein. I think everything's been attributed to Einstein, Mark Twain, or Abraham Lincoln. But the idea, that if you can't explain something to a 7-year-old, like you don't understand it well enough. But I have that same kind of experience when I attempt to reduce my ideas to writing sometimes. And it's like, oh, that wasn't as important. Or, hey, that's really 3 separate ideas, 2 of which have no place in this work or something. But let me ask you that, as you went through this process of, years of teaching, and then you started to organize it and write it down, what were your organizing principles? How did you structure it? And we've talked about stories a little bit. How did you identify stories? Because they're often like the water we swim in, right? How did you go, oh, that's a story that has a place in this book? So the big picture, organization and structure, and then specifically, how did you collect and incorporate stories into that?
So like most writers, I would start with an outline. What's the big idea I want to communicate? What are the steps towards that outline? And the outline always looked so clear as an outline. And then I would try and write it. And there would be like these jumps that I hadn't realized and I weren't clear. But I would try and write down the fundamental structure of the chapter. And then I'd ask, what am I trying to communicate here? What is the emotional feeling I want to get? What is the story that really illustrates this idea? And I would try out different stories, just see if they worked. And that was one of the most fun things about doing the book, is chasing down stories. I would ask friends, I would read books. Many of the stories ended up being the personal stories that people I had actually known, but there are also stories just from books because they were so amazing. One of my favorite is the Cadburys Story, which is about 2 brothers in England in the 19th century that inherited a close to bankrupt confectionery company. And they were Quakers, and they thought that business should be in the service of the spiritual life, and they really meant it. And they built an incredible factory in a garden. They talked about it being a factory in the garden. They paid everyone way more than people normally paid, and they gave them gyms and education, and then they involved them in running in the company. And in the late 19th century, this was a really unusual thing to do. And they built one of the most successful firms in England. And I was lucky because there's been a lot written about that, a lot of personal stuff out there, so you can get a sense for who they were and what they were like. But I would try that story out. And tons of stories I tried, I just ended up throwing away because they didn't work. So trial and error, at least that was my method.
I know that trial and error can be a common thing. How did you, when it came to using a story, how did you think about it? And especially, I don't know if you had this experience, but where for a lot of these, either they were things that you were told, so it was at best secondhand. You weren't there as an observer to paint the rich detail and embellish or recall the exact words and things like that. But how did you think about where to start a story, where to end it, how much of the conclusion to try to draw for the reader, things like that?
Oh, I have so much to learn about how to do that well. What I tried to do was establish a character. So it's a real person, someone that you can actually get some sense of who they are and why they're doing what they're doing. And that for me was a big criteria. If I was going to tell a story, there had to be someone I had some sense for. And then there has to be some kind of challenge or choice, because too many stories in too many business books just make it all seem so easy. Like, well, yeah, I just showed up. And of course, it was obvious that I should do X because that's what everyone should do. And it makes it sound as though all of us should be like doing this all the time. And I'm so aware of how hard making change really is. And so I wanted stories that gave you a sense of what was hard about it. And then I wanted some details about what the change was, like really what was going on. So it wasn't just the example you mentioned, Mark Bertolini raised everyone's wages. Well, whose wages and by how much and why and what happened when he did that and what did other people say? So trying to really get some sense of context. As far as conclusion goes, that's so hard, right? Do you say, well, gentle reader, this story shows you X? Or do you say nothing at all and open another? I forget how I managed that. For me, it was the hardest part of writing is the transitions, is setting up new ideas and introducing new ideas and saying, well, here's what you learned in this bit and here's where we're going next, without saying, here's what we learned in this bit, here's where we're going next. So those were really hard. That's all I can say is I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote.
Well, I know we're just about at the end of our time here. So really, I just want to ask two final questions, and I'll tell you the last one first, so you'll have a sense of where, we'll wrap up. But that question will be either specific to writing, is there a piece of encouragement or advice that you would give people who are in the middle of their own project to, help them complete and ideally make a difference in the world with their ideas and their talents and resources? But there's also the second part of that is like as larger, just general advice, for life. Is there something that you would leave the listener with? So that's the last thing, writing and life advice generally. But the question before that is there anything as it relates to the creative process that you learned that was useful to you, that was surprising, that was anything that has changed you as a person, anything like that? So I know I'm doing the thing where I'm stacking questions, but I know writing can be, it's such a fascinating thing. The intersection of ideas and language and people and our own experience and this kind of thing. So if there's anything else related to that mysterious and sometimes alchemical or magical act that you've learned that served you well, I'd love to know about that. And then the final thing.
Sure. And for me, the two questions are related. What I learned is that the more you revise, the better it gets. I know that's not true for everyone. I know it's possible to polish too much. But for me, and this is the advice I would give about writing, this is what I learned, is get that first draft down. Sometimes people refer to it, I actually found this useful, as a shitty first draft. Just write it down and let it sit a little bit and then come back to it and go, oh my God, and rewrite it. And then come back to it and go, no, and rewrite it. I think I wrote every part of the book at least 4 or 5 times. And I rewrote it with different timings. So I would try and get a chapter right. Not right, but at least together, like have a coherent draft. So I'd spend 2 or 3 weeks, get a chapter. Then I'd move on to another chapter. Then I'd do another chapter. And then I'd come back. So within that, I would rewrite pieces within the chapter. But then I'd come back to the chapter with fresh eyes again. And it really got better. I was just amazed. It really got better. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the life advice. I'm no expert in life. Life is hard. If I had to say something, I would say take life both more seriously and less. As I get older, I become aware of how limited our time is. The loss of my first husband, losing my father. We don't have infinite time, so take it really seriously. Pay as much attention as you can. When my first husband died, that was my first response. I should have paid more attention. We're so focused on tomorrow and all those worries we carry around with us, and they do no good. Worrying does no good at all, which doesn't mean I don't do it, but I know it does no good. Instead, let's try and live where we are. And so let's take life more seriously and then take life less seriously. Because life is a song, the universe is singing. That's who we are. And we are fragile, and we're just individuals, just humans. We can't ever quite live up to what we hope to. So at least that's the tension I try and hold in my own life is, yes, this is for real, and I do what I can. But in the end, we're stardust blowing on the wind, a bunch of energy, electrons circling in the void. And what's important.
That's beautiful. Well, Rebecca, I think I said something a little earlier, but I'm really glad to know that you're teaching, our business leaders. I know that Harvard really does pride itself on preparing, the world's leaders, and it does. And your book surprised me. Our conversations surprised me. I've really enjoyed them both. And I'm grateful to you for making time to do this and to know that you're doing the work you're doing. So please keep it up. And I wish you all the best in your every endeavor.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for the work you do, trying to connect people to ideas and others. It's incredibly important in the time when it's so easy to feel isolated and alone. And the kind of work you're doing, I think, is incredibly important. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to read my book and to invite me and to give me time and space. And thank you most of all for the fabulous questions. These are amazing. Really, really fun. Thank you very, very much.
Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life isn't working for many people. Whether it's in the developed world, where we're dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, divorce, jobs we hate, relationships that don't work, or people in the developing world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or who live in conflict zones. There's a lot of people on the planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, I invite you to connect with me at goodliving.com. I've created Life's Best Practices Breakthrough Coaching to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated school, you're going through a divorce, you just got married, you're headed into retirement, you're starting a business, you just lost your job, whatever it is you're facing, I've developed a 36-week course that you go through with me and a community of achievers and seekers who are committed to improving their own lives and the lives of others. So through this online program, you will have the opportunity to go deep into every area of your life, explore life's big questions, create answers for yourself in community, get clarity and accountability. If that's something you're interested to learn about, I invite you to contact me directly at brian@brianmiller.com or by visiting goodliving.com.